In the last few years, APIs have been promoted from a development technique to a business model driver and a topic of C level discussions. Through APIs, today an organization's core assets can be reused, shared, and monetized. And this open up new revenue stream for the companies too. We see that almost all software application expose APIs somewhere within the system from the internal classes, packages, and modules to the external system. And these days, we treat APIs the way we treat software products. So, what is an API in simple terms and how it is different from the application from a user's perspective? Because sometimes the line between an API and the application got so blurred that it create confusion in the mind of a normal user that what's the difference. So, well, we can say that the applications are the ways through which we, the human users, interact with the system, while APIs are the way or medium through which one application or service talks to the other applications or services. It's an interface for two or more applications or services to communicate with each other. And now, since the business around APIs has evolved too, these APIs are being offered as the product to users, particularly to the developer community. That's why we see every major platform out there, from social media to music apps to map providers to weather services, etc. All offer their APIs as the product, a trend which fuels the API economy too. So, in a nutshell, API offers a better way to encapsulate and share information and enable transaction processing between elements in the solution stack. And for developers, the APIs make it easier to access the capabilities or data of another application or system rather than having to build everything from scratch. This enables developer to leverage the functionality of existing systems and build new applications quickly and efficiently. So, what are some of the best practices or consideration to keep in mind related to API driven applications or API driven development? The first category is related to design. It advocates the use of consistent and clear API design practices, like using nouns in resource URLs and using HTTP verbs to indicate actions. As we know, we access APIs through URL, and an API URL path is an address that allows you to access an API and its various features. So, this should be designed carefully. The second category is about versioning. Use versioning for APIs to maintain backward compatibility and avoid breaking existing clients. The third one is related to security. Of course, ensure the API has proper authentication and authorization mechanism in place, like using API keys, OAuth, JSON, web tokens, etc., as per the scenario. Then provide complete and up to date API documentation, including examples of request and response payloads. And like an application, error handling for API is crucial too. So define clear error response codes and messages for expected errors like 404 not found or 401 unauthorized, and so on. Optimize API performance by caching frequently used data, implementing pagination, and using appropriate data compression techniques. Automate testing of API endpoints to ensure they are working as intended and to catch any regression early on. Then monitoring. Monitor API users and performance to identify and fix any issues in a timely manner. And have a clear process for deprecating the old API versions and communicating the changes to users in advance too. So you should have a clear process for deprecating the old APIs as well. And as you are designing, exposing the APIs to the external world, your users are the developer community. So, encourage a developer community around your API by providing support, examples, and SDKs to simplify integration. Other than these common best practices, there are two interesting points mentioned in the book: continuous delivery in Java, essential tools and best practices for deploying code in production, authored by Daniel Brandt and Abraham Marin Perez, where they have mentioned that a good API is typically designed outside in, as this is the best way to meet user requirements without overly exposing internal implementation details. The authors have mentioned that one of the challenges with classical service oriented architecture was that APIs were often designed inside out, which means that the interface presented leaked details on the internal entities and functions provided. This violates the principle of encapsulating data and in turn mean that services that are integrating with other services are highly coupled as they relied on internal implementation. So the main point here is that API design process should be iterative, and we can use a BDD technique called the three amigos as they have mentioned. The technique says that any requirement should be defined with at least one developer, one QA specialist, and one project stakeholder present. That is what we call the outside in. The second recommendation in the book is that good APIs assist continuous testing and delivery. So a good API is one that assists your continuous testing and delivery, and that includes easier automation of test fixture setup and tear down via internal resource endpoints, easier automation of specification test, automatic validation of API contracts using techniques like consumer contracts and consumer driven contracts. And for testing purposes, we should have mechanism in place through which dependent services that expose functionality through an API can be efficiently mocked, stubbed, or virtualized. And finally, the author says that there should be an easier access to metrics and monitoring data via internal resource endpoints too. So these are some of the best practices or considerations and some of the interesting points to keep in mind while building an API or participating in an API driven development or developing an API driven application.